Hello everyone, my name is Trish Lynch from IOHR here in London. Thank you for being with us on another episode of Human Rights TV. The Muslim Rohingyas are an ethnic minority living in the northwestern Rakhine state of Myanmar. Shocking images have dominated our news headlines since the 21st of November 2016, with thousands of members of Rohingya being slaughtered in cold blood, driven from their homes and burned to death. A genocide committed by an army that has shown no remorse. With us today is Mr. Ashish Joshi, an award-winning international correspondent and news presenter with Sky News, who has visited the region many times and witnessed the Myanmar state's campaign of terror against the Rohingya community. These are innocent people who have endured atrocities that one cannot even begin to imagine. Now, his experiences speaking to the Rohingya who are forced to flee their homes among violence also prompted him to start a campaign to raise money for Zura, an orphan he met in a refugee camp while filming. Now, she witnessed her mother, her father, her brothers and her sisters all being slaughtered. Mr. Joshi, welcome to the show. Thank you for being with us here today. Now, I think it's probably fair to say that before the Rohingya Muslim crisis, most people would not have been familiar with who they were. Give me a brief outline on who they are.
The Rohingya are an ethnically separate group that live in the spit of land between Bangladesh and Myanmar. They are ethnically different because they look, to all intents and purposes, like many of the people from the subcontinent, the Asian subcontinent. And that really is the heart of their problem. It's their identity. It's because they don't look like the ethnic Burmese that they've been singled out as not belonging to Burma. And that really is the heart of the Rohingya identity issue, which has been driving this conflict for decades.
Now, they have a different language, they have a different religion, they have a different identity, and I suppose this hasn't helped the divide between the Buddhists and the Rohingya, has it?
It certainly hasn't helped them to be accepted by the ethnic Burmese. But when you look at Burma, you have to understand it's not simply a question of ethnic Burmese who are all Buddhists. Burma is a very complex mix of tribes, ethnicities, all belonging within that geographical boundary, which is now modern-day Burma. These are people who have lived in this area for thousands of years. If you study the history and movement of people, you will understand that the Rohingya ended up where they live now because of movement in agriculture, in fishing, in farming, the way people move around the world for generations since civilization began. So this whole notion of who are they, where do they belong, this has just been concocted by the Myanmar authorities very recently. You know, we're talking about since the creation of modern-day Burma after the Second World War. So it's really a bit of a nonsense to start talking about who belongs where in the 21st century.
The Myanmar government says that this violence is about getting rid of terrorism. What do you think is the truth of this matter?
There was an attack on Burmese military posts, checkpoints and police posts in August last year, on the 25th of August. And many people who've been studying the Rohingya conflict say that was really the flashpoint which gave the Myanmar authorities legitimacy in reacting to what had happened, these attacks on their posts. Yeah. But to say the consequential action by the authorities, the soldiers, has been disproportionate is a huge understatement. We are talking about a ragtag army of people. Army is an exaggeration. A handful of people who belong to a group called ASA. They're a separatist movement within the Rohingya community, which have not been accepted by the wider Rohingya community. These are a group of people who have banded together against one of the most powerful military machines in South Asia. They carried out a number of attacks, we are told, because we can't verify this, we're not allowed into the region, and the Myanmar authorities say that their reaction to these attacks was military action, a campaign, in their own words, a campaign to flush out these terrorists, identify them and take action. The consequences have been 650,000 people flooding across a border because they're afraid for their lives.
The persecution of the Rohingya minority has been described by the UN as a textbook case of ethnic cleansing. Do you agree with the label ethnic cleansing?
Absolutely, yes. And the reason why the UN said it was textbook ethnic cleansing, because you have to look at what's been happening to the Rohingya for generations. You deprive a people of their identity. You will not hear anyone inside Myanmar refer to these people as Rohingya, because if you call them Rohingya, you've legitimized them.
Because they're stateless, aren't they?
They're stateless. They have no state. They're not recognized by Myanmar. They have no citizenship. They are confined within northern Rakhine state. They're not allowed free movement. They are deprived of healthcare, education. Many of them live in concentration camps. They are not allowed access to fair and free labor. So most of them are poor farmers and fishermen who are confined to a very small geographical area. They're not allowed into the wider Myanmar state as normal citizens of a country are allowed. So that begins, you strip away their identity, and then you start killing people, you start raping their women and children, and you drive them from their homes, and then you burn down whatever homes and shops and businesses and mosques they had. You erase all connection, anything which is a cultural reference to these people once existing somewhere. Once they're gone and they have nothing to return to, that to me is textbook ethnic cleansing.
Now, the world considers Buddhism and Buddhists to be peace-loving people. How can they carry out these atrocities?
The majority of Buddhists are peace-loving, law-abiding citizens who embrace faiths and religions and have such an understanding of compassion that they've shared with the rest of the world. If you look at the Dalai Lama and his teachings, and he is a Buddhist leader, the trouble with Buddhism in this case is we all have an idea of what we think Buddhism is like. In Myanmar, the Buddhism that defines the people there is a very violent form of Buddhism in the sense that it teaches its followers, its adherents, that you must defend your religion. It's a brand, it's a type of Buddhism. There are lots of different types of Buddhism. There's a particular type in Myanmar, which, I'll give you an example. What they do is the generals there and the Buddhist leaders, and remember that this conflict, this ethnic cleansing, is being driven not just by Myanmar soldiers, it's been driven by hardline Buddhist clerics who tell their people, their followers, that these Rohingya, they're not animals, they're not human, they are animals, they have been reincarnated, they are really cockroaches or rats, and it's okay if you kill these people, that's fine because there will be no bad karma. This is the sort of Buddhism that's being taught or espoused to these people. And we saw a similar sort of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, where it's a martial type of Buddhism which was used to defend its own religion. If there are outsiders, our Buddhism will end. So as far as they're concerned, this is about survival of Buddhism in Myanmar.
Now, an estimated 622,000 Rohingya refugees have fled to neighbouring countries, mainly to Bangladesh. What's it like being a reporter on the ground and watching this humanitarian crisis unfold?
You feel utterly helpless. You feel like you can't do anything, but also you were driven by the hope that your reporting ultimately will bring the plight of these people to the attention of the world. And you have to be quite professional. You can never be detached. You can't suddenly parachute yourself into the midst of so much desperation and suffering and operate remotely. Right. But you have to understand that you're there to do a job, and your job is to report truthfully and faithfully the experiences of these people who've suffered so much. When we first arrived, there was absolutely no help for the tens of thousands of Rohingya refugees who were part of the initial exodus.
Nothing at all. Did this surprise you?
Yeah, it did. It did surprise me because I'm an experienced international correspondent. I have about 20 to 30 years of covering conflicts and humanitarian and environmental disasters. And if you're the first one there, obviously there isn't going to be any help, or there's going to be very little help. So if I turn up and a tsunami has just hit there will be utter devastation, but in the days and weeks to follow, help will arrive. I went to the border area between Myanmar and Bangladesh about 10 days after the initial exodus. And I honestly thought, I can remember I was sitting in my seats on the plane, landing in Cox's Bazar, looking out of the window thinking, this is going to be a story of how the international community has mobilized really quickly and effectively to help these people. I was expecting to see a vast swathe of tarpaulin tents branded with Red Cross, UNHCR, World Food Programme. I was expecting to see the NGOs from the international communities geared up and providing relief for these people. Instead, we found absolutely nothing. And this is 10 days after the initial exodus. So we knew, we'd seen some of these pictures supplied by agencies and local Bangladeshi television crews. We saw these pictures of people carrying everything they owned on their backs or in their arms, young children, coming across the border. And I thought, 10 days afterwards, I can't be the only person who's seen these pictures. The world must know what's going on. And there was nothing there. There were only local Bangladeshi, not even charities, friends who had clubbed together, friends who would get together and get some food, some clothing, some blankets, anything they could, into the back of a big truck, drive along the highway, throwing these things out, and then you would see heartbreaking scenes, children running behind these trucks, old people grappling around in the mud for scraps of food. It was probably one of the worst experiences I've seen in the early days of the Rohingya conflict. I've not seen images like that before.
There are reports that more than 6,700 Rohingya have been murdered and at least 730 children under the age of 5. Do you feel that the international community have abandoned the Rohingya?
Certainly in the past. Are they trying to help the Rohingya right now? They are, in as much as they will provide aid and relief to the Rohingya who have made it out of Myanmar. But the trouble with this crisis, with this conflict, is the Myanmar authorities refuse any organization, whether they're an NGO, a charity, or they're journalists, or the international agencies under the auspices of the United Nations, access to Rakhine State. We don't know what's happening inside Myanmar. We are not allowed to go and report what is happening there. So the international community, on the one hand, is powerless to act, and it has been seen to sit on its hands for so long. Although there is a great deal of goodwill and a sense of desperation that something must be done, Burma still enjoys the protection of Russia and China as far as the UN Security Council is concerned. So the UN has not been able to apply the sort of pressure it would like to on the authorities inside Myanmar, and it still has no access to that area. So yes, they have been desperately let down by the international community in the past. I think more is being done to help them now, but not as much as they could. Sanctions is probably the only way forward now.
Satellite images show that at least 210 villages have been either partially or totally destroyed since August 2017. What do you make of this? Do you think they're trying to wipe them off the map completely?
Yes, that's exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to erase any connection that the Rohingya have with that part of Myanmar. If you erase their homes, if you burn their homes and you burn their villages and their schools and their mosques, you try and remove any connection that the Rohingya have with that part of Burma. They have nothing to return to. And what you're doing is really, you're culturally, you're wiping any connection that the Rohingya would have had with that part of Myanmar. So it's a real, and this doesn't happen by accident. This is a campaign. This is planned, orchestrated, and executed in such a way that it drives terror into people. If they know that they live here and a township a mile up the road or 2 miles in another direction, where those villagers, when their homes are being burned, they're still inside those homes. These are not empty villages. These are people who are inside their homes, and their homes are torched. They flee. They bring with them tales of terror, which drives even more people to flee. And this is the whole methodology of the Myanmar authorities and the way they've worked. It's systematic.
Now, the UN have said the Rohingya situation is the world's fastest growing refugee crisis. In previous episodes, we've highlighted the plight of Syrian and Yazidi refugees. How do you think viewers can help?
They can make sure that they're aware of the facts. And what my experience has told me is that people are genuinely engaged with the plight of the Rohingya. They are interested, they want to know, and it's really important that people who watch this broadcast, for example, or turn to their newspapers or to the web, however you get your news, what's really important is that you get your information from a credible, trustworthy and bona fide, not organisation, even if it comes from a person, you have to trust the source, because what's happening with the Rohingya conflict is that the Myanmar authorities are very, very adept at perpetuating a narrative that it's the Rohingya who are to blame, that these are jihadist Muslims who want to spread Islam throughout Myanmar, they are traitors, they want to undermine this fledgling democracy, that they will kill Hindus and kill Buddhists. Yeah. All of this narrative is easily spread, and it's accepted by the majority of the people inside Myanmar. Sadly, that's the case. These are lies, and they're baseless, but the machine, the military machine that still has an iron grip on the country, knows that this is how, through social media, it can spread this false narrative. So it's really important that anyone anywhere in the world who's interested in the plight of the Rohingya, who believes that people have the right to exist and their children shouldn't be thrown onto fires, their women shouldn't be raped, and that the men shouldn't be shot dead in front of their families, anyone who cares should make sure that they're aware of the situation and the plight of the Rohingya, and not believe the propaganda and the false narrative that's being perpetuated by the Myanmar authorities.
You've been on the ground watching these thousands of refugees fleeing to neighbouring countries, in particular Bangladesh. We've heard stories of children witnessing their entire families being massacred or their parents drowning in the crossing. What's it like to be there and to see this happening?
It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking because you can deal with great difficulty, or you can deal with great difficulty by listening to one story of a child who has witnessed his or her parents being shot dead in front of them, or hacked to death with a machete, or seeing their parents and their siblings drown on a boat crossing. That's really hard, but perhaps you can deal with one or two stories. Almost any person you stop, and there are 650,000 and more stories like this, they're not in isolation. And that's really, as a correspondent, as an observer, as a witness to these atrocities, that's what struck me. It's not one isolated incident. Almost anyone you speak, everyone has seen an act of such barbarity and cruelty, and the children will grow up harbouring these thoughts and these scenes into adulthood. They will stay with them for the rest of their lives. You know, there are husbands who've seen their wives raped. There are mothers who've seen their daughters raped. The gang rape, systematic and perpetuated to drive these people, to put fear into their hearts. I spoke to so many people who would make this sea crossing, which is it's dangerous. These are small fishing boats which should have 10, maybe 15 people max on their vessels. They are overcrowded with 60 or 70 people making these rough sea crossings. These boats tip over, suddenly you have a whole village gone.
Gone, wiped out.
Gone in a matter of minutes. If you have survivors, they've seen their mothers and fathers drown, their children drown, being swept away. Some of the stories are so difficult to try and comprehend. Mothers who have had to make a choice between holding on to one child and another, not being able to hold on to two. So they let one child go, and they can hear this child being swept away, calling out for help, drowning. And these are the people you deal with. And it's not just the one story. Everyone has one of these stories.
Their own story.
Yeah.
What about the refugee camps? Tell me what the refugee camps in Bangladesh and Myanmar are like. Are they swapping one hell for another?
Yes, yeah, they are. And a lot of the Rohingyas, the refugees you speak to, will talk one day about returning to Myanmar, but under the right conditions, where they're recognized as citizens, they have identity and a connection with the state that accepts them as legitimate Myanmar citizens. But ultimately what they know is inside these camps, like this is in Kutupalong, this is the main refugee camp where the majority of the people are. I mean, these are tarpaulin sheets held together with bits of bamboo. These are not living conditions.
No.
You
Open to the elements on all sides?
Yeah, they are. I mean, in the monsoon season, this will turn into a swamp. This is mud and clay which has been hardened by the sun, and this is virgin forest, which a couple of months ago was covered with trees and rubber plantations mostly. They know that they have made it to safety, but even inside these camps, they are still vulnerable, they're still exposed. And what they want is they want eventually to go back to Myanmar, but they can't.
Do they have a sense of relief that they've made it this far?
They know, yes, yeah, because they know that they've escaped with their lives.
Yeah.
They have access, most of them, they are extremely malnourished. The malnutrition rates are so high that there's a real danger that people will just start dying inside these camps. But they know it's difficult, but they have access to some medical care. But the doctors you speak to who've been treating these people say they haven't been seen for months. Not just since they arrived inside these refugee camps, but they had no access to healthcare inside Bangladesh. So they are malnourished, they suffer from dehydration, there's rickets. And even inside these camps now, the most recent outbreak was diphtheria, which claimed dozens of lives. Measles, every time you speak to a doctor who's treating these people, they say we are one infection away from a massive outbreak, which could kill hundreds. These are people living cheek by jowl, hundreds of thousands of people. Fresh water, hardly available. Sanitation is really poor. Their health needs are overriding. All of these contributory factors, you're just one outbreak away from an epidemic.
What about sexual exploitation of young, vulnerable women and children? Is it as widespread as we're led to believe?
It's a real issue. It's a really, really big problem. One of the most striking things about this conflict is the number of women who have been made either orphaned as young children or made widowed, because most of the people who have been involved in this conflict, I think children, alarmingly high proportion, women, alarmingly high numbers. And what happens to these women when they arrive inside these camps, if they have no guardian and no protection from a husband or a brother or a father, a male figure, these are patriarchal societies. Yeah. If they have no protection, they're exposed and they're vulnerable. If they've been widowed, they know they can be targeted by traffickers and made to work in the sex industry in Bangladesh. Children disappear. They are trafficked into wider Bangladesh, inside the bigger cities like Cox's Bazar or Chittagong or Dhaka, or they are smuggled across the border to work in brothels inside India. All children are at risk of exploitation. All the women are vulnerable and they need help and protection. It's a really, really dangerous time for these people to be inside these camps, because the traffickers, and I've met them and I've talked to them, and I know the people who exploit these vulnerable, desperate people, I know how they operate, and in the words of one trafficker, business has never been better.
Now tell me about Zura, because she is a 12-year-old orphan that you met in a refugee camp. She somehow touched your heart and you've taken her under your wing. Tell me her story and tell me what you're doing to help her.
Zura she's a 12-year-old, this is Zura, she's a 12-year-old girl who is the survivor of the Tulatoli massacre. In years to come, when we look back at what has happened inside Myanmar and we talk about genocide or ethnic cleansing, you will become familiar with the name of this village, Tulatoli. It's probably the Srebrenica of this conflict. Hundreds of people were slaughtered. We know this because it's been documented, because the survivors have given their testimony to international observers. So we know this massacre took place.
And this girl saw her entire family being slaughtered.
She was playing outside her house one morning. Her mother, father, brothers and sisters, all at home. Soldiers arrived, started shooting, started setting fire to her village. She ran away. She escaped down a riverbank and onto a small island on this riverbank, and she saw her mother and father and the rest of her family shot. And as she was fleeing, she was shot in the thigh. And I think she passed out and she was carried by local villagers across the border into Bangladesh, where she was reunited with her younger brother, and they are the only two remaining survivors from her family. She now lives inside this refugee camp with extended members of her family, not formal relatives.
Yeah. Distant
Yeah. Relatives who lived in the same village. She is particularly vulnerable because she's 12 years old. She's a girl, she's on her own. What's happening inside the refugee camps is young girls are being married off.
As young as 12?
As young, or younger, because that brings two families together, and they think by having a larger family, they have more access to aid.
Okay.
So they think they're doing the right thing, but of course, you can't marry 12-year-old girls off. It's simply not acceptable by any standard. But what is really worrying is that girls like Zura are being trafficked and sold into prostitution and being kidnapped from these camps by human traffickers. And the reason that I have connected to Zura is because I felt I had to do something. There are thousands of children and people who need our help there. I felt I was in a position to help Zura because I'm an international correspondent. Sky have allowed me to tell my story of my connection to her. So lots of viewers have contributed towards a fund I've set up for her. What I hope to do is to make sure that her future is secure. She is looked after in terms of her education, in terms of her safety.
And how can this happen in the refugee camp?
It can happen because we have a good network of people that I have been working with in Bangladesh. You simply, I know it's really difficult, but you simply can't turn up in a country and have this savior complex and say, I want to help people.
Yeah.
It's really difficult. What happens to the money? Where, she's 12 years old, does she have a bank account? All of these things have to be thought about. I have a network of Bangladeshi colleagues who are very well aware of how the system works. So they can set up bank accounts, they can work with local charities,
okay,
and they can make sure that she has a fund that only she has access to. We're also very aware that if a young child like this, who's only 12 years old, suddenly comes into a lot of money, she becomes vulnerable too. I have safeguards in place to make sure that she's protected. We have Rohingya refugees who've been born and raised in those camps from previous conflicts, who live not very far from Zura, who are able to keep an eye on her, make sure she's protected. And ultimately, what I want people around her to know is that there are people outside Bangladesh who have a very close connection to Zura, and we want to make sure that she's protected and not exploited by traffickers, because she has come to our attention. And thankfully, a lot of people have contributed, and we have made quite a big contribution already towards her immediate future. So I'm hopeful that she's one out of hundreds of thousands of Rohingya children that we can look after.
That you've really made a difference to. If viewers are watching this and they'd like to get involved and they'd like to help Zura, obviously we will give your details, but what can they do immediately?
If they want, and what I want to make absolutely clear at the start of this is people are under no obligation to contribute. If they feel that by watching this and they would like to help in some small way, then they can go to this Just Giving page. We're crowdfunding, we're trying to raise £15,000. Log on, make a donation, help Zura if they want to. Any contribution, irrespective of how big or small, will help. It will help to provide Zura with an education. It will help to make sure she's not exploited. And hopefully, it will help to make sure that the trauma and suffering that she has suffered at such a young age and all the things she's seen will not determine how she spends the rest of her life, that she will have a happy, secure and healthy childhood from now on, because we haven't been there to help Zura in her 12 years where she saw so much suffering, but we can certainly help her for the rest of her life. And she has a young brother to support as well.
And at least make a difference.
Make a difference to Zura's life, yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Joshi. Thank you for coming in and sharing your incredible stories with us. Thank you.
My pleasure, thank you.
Thank you. Now, if you'd like to help Zura and make a difference, please visit the Just Giving website. The details are on your screen. Thank you for being with us on this episode of Human Rights TV. Please join us again next time. Until then,